Hi there.
Hello. Thanks very much for joining.
It's quite all right. Wow, IT working first time and everything.
I know this is the first time. This is the first time it's happened.
Yeah.
Everything's going well so far.
Has it not?
No, well, there was a couple of
Yeah.
hiccups, as to be
Yeah.
expected. It's a fantastic platform. Everything's been going very well, but a couple of tiny hiccups.
Seems to be working quite well. Seeing as though you've got so many sessions on the go.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I think we're pretty much bang on time, so we'll just get started. So, hello to anyone joining us. My name is Katie, and I am one of the sales managers at Elixir Distillers. And we are going to be doing an Elements of Islay tasting this evening, but with a bit of a difference, and we're going to be focusing a lot on peat. So to give you a bit of background, Elixir Distillers is an independent bottler. The second range that we started bottling from Islay was the Elements of Islay. So Elements of Islay is clearly focused on Islay whiskies and small batch, kind of more very, very small batch whiskies from a single malt was the original plan for Elements of Islay. So very small batches of single malts from every distillery on the island. And as you can see from the look of our bottles, clearly we took our inspiration from the whole chemistry involved in whiskey production and the elemental style of Islay whiskies. The idea behind these was to make small batches of fantastic whiskies, a few casks per batch, and no age statements on anything. So it's slightly kind of our experimental range, perhaps. And we have one history with the brand and with peat itself. I thought it would be very nice to do a bit of a deep dive into the chemistry of peat. So I am delighted to have Adam McCudden join me this evening, who is much more knowledgeable about all things peaty and chemistry. So Adam is the founder of Manchester Whisky Club and also the author of the Manchester Pyromaniacs blog. And in your spare time, I think you do a bit of other pharmaceutical stuff, right, Adam?
Yeah, my day job's working on analytical chemistry for a large pharmaceutical company.
Okay, so busy year. So thank you very much for taking the time.
It's quite right.
But outside of that, obviously, you've been doing some interesting experiments into peat.
Yeah, for a few years now. So I've always liked peated whiskies. So for about the last 20 years or so, and I see Julie's on the chat as well. So she's had them inflicted on her in the past.
Yeah, I'm really upset that I didn't see the tasting firsthand, but I know that you've been doing some very, very interesting things. So yeah, you've been interested in whiskey for a while. You say, was it whiskey or chemistry was your first love?
Chemistry first. So I liked cocktails to begin with. I was about 20 before I started drinking beer, and despite my granddad's best efforts to get me into Lafroig from being about that high, I didn't actually like whiskey until probably 22, 23, something like that.
Because of Lafroig, maybe because of trying to get a child to drink Lafroig.
But perhaps it worked on my little sister. She got into whiskey a lot earlier than I did, but right. It was a friend actually. I buy a bottle I bought for him as a birthday present, and Arbeg 10, and I was like, I don't really like it, but there's some really interesting notes there. And once I got used to drinking whiskey, found more of those interesting notes, and go, oh, actually, once you get used to drinking whiskey, it's not too bad. And there's all these crazy smoky, fruity estery notes there that you get in there, and are really interesting. And so started drinking Islay whiskies about 18, 19 years ago, and haven't looked back since.
Yeah, fantastic. And then, so then you started doing a couple of years ago, did you say, your first kind of experiments into ppm and peat?
Yeah, so back probably about 2009, when you had Optimor and Supernova first coming out in kind of larger batches. I was kind of puzzled by the fact that some of the more traditional Islay whiskies didn't taste a lot less peatier than those, and ran a tasting back in 2009 for the Royal Society of Chemistry, and I was pretty much certain that Lafroig was going to come out as the peatiest whiskey, and doing a straw poll amongst the 30 or 40 people that are there, they actually voted Lagavulin 16, which is like, no, that's wrong. And then the ppm numbers say this, and I think this. So why are we getting all different answers on here? So the last sort of 3 or 4 years, I've started doing things a bit more scientifically and actually measuring ppm levels in bottles of whiskey myself, and then looking at how they actually tie in with how peaty people actually find them.
Okay, so kind of the difference between the perception of how peaty it is and what the reality of the ppm and
what the numbers say and kind of how much stock you put in them.
So we'll get a lot deeper into that as we go through this tasting, but that's you've got lots of figures to share with us, I know, and lots of interesting information. But essentially, we are going to be tasting along with the Elements of Islay pack. So essentially, whenever I do tastings, I feel like I hear more and more kind of so-called facts about peat. People always have lots to say about it. And for a while, I've wanted to kind of try and do a bit of a Mythbusters tasting. So if you do have the Elements of Islay pack at home, we're going to be tasting along with this. And the idea is that we'll be tasting a whiskey and then looking at a myth and dispelling it, or not, essentially. So it's kind of a whiskey and lies pairing. So we'll look at it. So the first whiskey that we are going to taste is, of course, the Elements of Islay peat. Have you got your pack there, Adam, as well?
I have, yeah. So it's
good.
Right behind and carefully, my fantastically neat writing on my glasses.
Oh, nice! You've actually labelled yours. I just laid them out very quickly in a straight line. So we're going to start with peat. So the Elements of Islay peat is actually a blended malt. And is the only part of the range which is bottled at 45%. So the majority of what we do are, we call them foolproof rather than cask strength. Most of them are bottled at a high strength, but occasionally reduced slightly if necessary. But peat is the only part of the range which is bottled at 45% and is a blended malt. It's made up of whiskies from Kalila and Lagavulin. So interesting. We'll have an interesting comparison of those two distilleries when it comes to production and ppm later. But we're looking at sort of that really nice lighter style from Kalila. So some really nice kind of citrusy, briny. I know I said this to you, Adam. I always think that like Kalila's got that kind of briny, salty note to it. But apparently, that's all in my mind. Is that right?
It's not a taste. It could be a flavour, and those maritime notes you get there. I definitely get the citrus. So Kalila for me is always somewhere between lemons and oranges.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things where I managed to pull out one of your other range, the Porterskeg 100 proof bottling. Managed to identify that blind at one of our tastings, which I was really impressed with.
Fantastic! You must know it well. Well done.
It was a complete cheat because it was obviously a Kalila that was in there, and they told us the proof, and they said it was bought from the exchange. Where it's like just after it's not really a blind tasting you when you give that much information away.
Yeah, and it rhymes with Porterskeg.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, this has definitely got that like lemony, flinty note to it. But the Lagavulin does give it a little bit more oomph. So, and we've named it peat because, peat is essentially, you could consider the most important element of Islay. So, when I think it's very hard to think about Islay whiskies and not think about peat. So it is something that's very, very closely connected to the island, obviously. And interestingly, you might be able to answer this for me as well, actually. I often find, so this at 45%, I often find on the nose, I get a lot more of the smoky, peaty aromas than I do on a higher ABV. Yep. Is that because the alcohol's just kind of hiding some of the aromas, or is there something about anything else that would cause that?
There was a paper probably about 2 years ago. That's what a couple of guys did on computer modeling with guaiacol, which is one of the phenols in there. And all the phenols kind of like water more than they like the alcohol. And you look at your dram, it looks pretty much like a single liquid. But if you've ever had water to a high cask strength ABV, dram, you'll see like layers kind of go out, and it goes luscious a bit like absinthe when you add water to it.
Yeah.
And that's because it's not actually just all one liquid there. You've got things called micelles, which are basically like bubbles. And depending on the ABV, you've either got bubbles of alcohol or bubbles of water in the rest, which is either water or alcohol. And they can attract some of the flavors. So basically, as you start changing the water content in there, some of those bubbles pop or kind of disperse. And then the flavors go out into the main body of the liquid, which makes them easier to smell. So if you ever have like stupidly strong bourbons, like Stag at like 70%, and you go, oh, this is really mild mannered at 70% ABV, and you add some water and knock it down to about 50, you go, oh, where did that come from? And you are basically getting a face full of those really strong flavors.
Okay, so it's more that it's like easier to smell rather than
they're almost trapped in some of those bubbles to begin with. Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely get with this that actually compared to, we also do peat foolproof at 59.3%, and that to me, I don't get as much peat on the nose, but it really comes through on the palate. But with this, really, like lovely, like smoky kind of Lapsang Souchong, along with that like lemon citrus, really flinty notes. But peat then, obviously incredibly important on Islay. And the myth that we were discussing here is Islay is about to run out of peat. It's something people ask a lot at tastings, I find. And are we about to run out of peat on Islay? Are we going to be able to keep drinking peaty Islay whiskies? So I think to sort of get to the crux of that, the most important thing to start with is to kind of identify what peat is. So you're much better at explaining things than I am, Adam.
Yeah. You kind of look on those pictures. Start on the top left. If you go back thousands and thousands of years, you have sphagnum moss or other plants in there. So you can have heather or rushes, and slowly get basically compressed and degrade over thousands of years, and you end up with a peat bog. So kind of if you're in the UK, if you go to places like Dartmoor or the Peak District, then you'll have like areas of moorland that have got lots of kind of peaty soil in there. That's the really dark stuff. And going back to when basically whiskey production first started, there wasn't the railways that could get coal or other types of fuel to basically dry the malted barley on. So they used the local source of fuel, which was peat. So even in places like Speyside, the local fuel source was peat. So most whiskies started out as peated drams and only swapped out to unpeated when coal became a better option. So there were plenty of rail lines going up to Speyside for industry. Not so many rail lines go to Islay for some reason.
Easy, no.
Now with the sound of Islay and the rough seas from the Kintyre to get over there, basically peat stayed as a better fuel source for a lot longer there, and so it's always been associated with Islay because they never made the move away to using coal. So go ahead, Kate.
I'm bringing up. Sorry, you're mentioning coal there. So another kind of sub myth that I'd like to dispel is people often talk about peat being early coal, but that's not necessarily the case, is it? So
there's a difference in vegetation. So I think coal can come from a whole range of things, and there's a lot more like tree-based kind of vegetation where it's a lot more like moss and heather that goes into forming peat. And the peat on Islay is mainly the classic style, which is sphagnum moss. Mm-hmm. It's quite a distinctive kind of flavour profile and phenols, different things that come through from there. And
those acidic conditions are necessary for the formation of peat, aren't they? Which maybe not necessarily for coal.
No, so like if any of you have seen kind of the brand of water that comes from various different regions, and one of the things that they say that's different around the Islay water source is the pH is lower, which means it's more acidic in there. So you've got more acidic conditions than you would do in places like Speyside where you have hard water, which means it's more alkaline. Mm-hmm. So once you kind of cut your peat banks, you end up with drying your peat and then using it as a source of smoke. So rather than it used to be the whole point of you basically used to power the fire all the way through the peating process in the kiln. But particularly now, one of the more sustainable ways that the distilleries that still do their own malting for the likes of Lafroig and Bowmore is actually only use peat for the very start of the process, where it's going to take on the most of the peat smoke, and they're actually using it for smoke rather than fire. So they're putting quite a lot of water on there to try and get as much smoke out of it, rather than actually burning it for heat. They use the coal or what it means to for the main part of getting the heat through there. I think we've got Katy's frozen for a second there. And so those of you who are not familiar with where peat comes into the process, basically the peat smoke is then used to permeate through the malted barley, so while it's still green barley, and dry it out, get rid of some water. And the benefits you get there is the peat smoke sticks to the outside of the husks of the malted barley, so you end up with a peated malt that smells very, very peaty itself. And then you go through the process to end up with your peated whiskey.
Am I back now?
You are. You're back.
So you said already one of the things that distilleries are doing to be more sustainable, which is something that's happened for a long time, is using a shorter period of drying the barley and rather infusing it for the very beginning of the process. So this is part of our myth busting here is Islay running out of peat? So peat, obviously, as you say, has been used not just for whiskey, but it was used for heating homes originally. And during the production of whiskey, there's already efforts to try and use less of it during the kilning. But the reasons that peat is important, of course, is it's not just for whiskey, obviously. The peat.
It's definitely the best use for peat, but one of the biggest uses is actually in compost and kind of peat for your garden, and that's the kind of big user. And yeah. I think you were asking around kind of whether we're running out of peat. Diageo, who, if you want to believe them or not, they do have a vested interest owning the maltings on Islay and 2 of the distilleries there. But by their calculations, there's at least 5,000 years worth of peat left on Islay for us to go at. So it's 1 or 2.
5,000 years left of peat, presumably in the
way it's going at the moment, and not all of that is actually economical to get to, because if it's at the top of the hill, it's much easier shipping some in rather than using stuff that's already there. If they have to drive 12 miles up a hill in a 4x4 and then carry it back down, it kind of defeats the point of being a cheap local fuel source at that point.
Yeah. And they're actually, not only is there a lot of peat left, but obviously it's important for wildlife on the island. So Islay's got a huge bird population, and the peatlands are really important. So I think Lagavulin has worked with the RSPB to actually start recreating some of the peatlands there as well. So even though there is a lot left, they're also kind of regenerating the peatlands.
Something like that, yeah.
A millimetre a year, isn't it?
Yeah, and the amounts they're actually using are actually quite small. So while we were digging around on the internet preparing for this one, turns out Port Ellen Maltings is using about 3,000 tonnes of peat each year, which sounds a lot. But when you actually do the maths, it's only about the size of a football pitch each year that is getting used up. And although Islay's not the biggest island in the world, there's room for 1 or 2 football pitches on there, I think.
Yeah, I was quite surprised as well. I thought that's actually quite big in terms, like when you think about the size of Islay. But I was looking at how much land's been regenerated, and it's the equivalent, I think, of 250 rugby pitches. So actually, yeah, it's not that, and that's just the amount that they're regenerating on the O and Lochbruna, I think, are the 2 kind of preservation areas. So thank you for your calculations. I really enjoyed your way of calculating things, either in football pitches or Wales's.
Well, it's the thing in volume is the blue whale is a standard unit of measure. So it goes, I think it's tennis court, football pitch, Wales and Texas, I think, are the
But yeah, it does one football pitch a year makes perfect sense. So essentially, I think we can put that one to bed. Then Islay is not about to run out of peat.
Yeah, and not any time, not in our lifetime, and not any.
Not in our lifetime. Obviously, very important carbon sinks that need, it is a finite resource. It's something we need to look after.
I think we're good for several millennia to go.
Good. That is a relief because it's delicious. Moving on, I'm actually, if you have a tasting pack, I've kind of switched a couple of these around, and we are going to taste the NA3 next. So peat, as I said, is a blended malt, and that's kind of our core expression in Elements of Islay, but where it all originally began was the bottling these small batch single malts. And obviously inspired by all this chemistry, we've created a full periodic table of Islay distilleries. You have a symbol which represents the distillery or the make in this case, and a number which is the batch number. It's not an age statement, so nothing has an age statement on it, and we don't feel like it's relevant. They're all excellent whiskies regardless of their age. And MA actually stands for Margadale. Margadale is, in this case, peated Bunnahabhain. So peated Bunnahabhain goes by a few different names, I think, and confusingly, the way that they release it is different to the way it's traded in cask, I think, as well. So you get a lot of very different, complicated names for Bunnahabhain. I get confused with the releases as well, but MA Margadale is a fairly heavily peated version of Bunnahabhain. And this is the third batch of Margadale that we did, and it's from 2 bourbon barrels which were distilled in 2004. I absolutely love this. It's got a very different type of peat to what we were smelling before. It's also got from those bourbon barrels quite a lot of kind of custardy, vanilla-y sweetness. But I find it's quite nutty as well, and I find the peat, I find a bit more earthy on this.
Especially after you've left it in the glass for a while. I kind of nosed and tasted them all about 2 hours ago before just as soon as I poured them out, having been out in the glass for an hour or two. It's really got a deep kind of nutty, earthy note to it. And I get quite a lot of pineapples in it, which I got straight off the nose when it was straight out of the bottle as well. It's quite an interesting. It's
yeah, definitely fruity, and pineapples and really stone fruit as well, a bit peachy, fruity and nutty and custardy, all the good things. It's a really, really lovely whiskey, and it's this one is at full proof, so it's at 55.2, which lovely big full texture, really nice mouthfeel. So Margadale is, of course, as I say, the water source for Bunnahabhain, which I thought would be a nice pairing with our myth, that the water is what gives the peaty flavour to the whiskey. So I think this is kind of one that's been dispelled a long time ago. It's not often thought anymore, but I think would be interesting to discuss though exactly where does the peaty flavour come from, and we're going to find out a little bit more about phenols.
So you say it's been fully myth-busted, but I've still heard it on a few distillery tours in the last 2 or 3 years. It's still getting trotted out as fact by a few guides at distilleries. So in terms of phenols, you'll probably have heard them talked about in ppm. I've actually measured the phenol content of the water from the well-known brand of water that makes whiskey specific, very expensive water, and it has less than 5 parts per billion phenols in it. So it has next nothing in there.
So there's absolutely no way, because I suppose even though we know that's not really where the peaty flavour comes from, I think there could still be some little arguments that definitely that peaty water makes a difference and adds something to the
things to bear in mind in there is like the previous owners of Bunnahabhain, on the back of their marketing blurb on the back of the bottle, talked about the wonderful water that flowed through the peat and gave it its natural brown colour or caramel colour on there. It's like, well, one of those voices right there with the the German edition of the bottle which said Mythbusters on the back on there, with colouring. So it was plenty of caramel colouring in there, and it was actually a source water that they were going through rather than through the peat bogs behind them. So
yeah, I mean, I don't think I would want to drink something.
Probably. Well, I grew up on the other side of the Pennines, and before they put the water treatment plant in, our water was slightly yellow, but it never tasted.
Yeah, no, I go to the Lake District quite a bit, and the water from the tap that when we stay up there is thoroughly
the soft
brown.
Water, and there's water that tastes of mud. It's kind of but the other thing to bear in mind is how much water you've been used to dilute in there. So it's one thing that people don't think about a lot when how peaty a whiskey is. You had peat to begin with, which has been let down with water, and if you've added water to it, then there's going to be less phenols just by the fact you've diluted it. So you're always going to get, if you get a Lafroig that's a cask strength or it's a 40 proof or 40 vol whiskey, the cask strength's always going to have more phenols in there because you've not diluted them away by adding water.
Yeah, and on that, actually, I suppose it's interesting in what that water is that's being used. It's rarely going to be kind of the peaty water that's used to dilute the whiskey either. I think usually it's kind of deionized mineral distilled water that's used to bring the ABV down.
So kind of the little kind of diagram you've got on the slides there is kind of shows where the peat comes in. So after you've kind of malted the barley, you're basically adding water to it, and then you're drying it out, tricking the barley into germinating to release a load of enzymes that's going to release a load of sugar that you can then use to turn into alcohol. If you just left it to its own devices, it'd turn itself into new barley plants and use all that sugar to make new barley plants, which we don't want. We want to steal all that sugar and turn it into yummy alcohol. So you need to dry it out, which is where the peat comes in. And basically using it for the likes of Lafroig and Bowmore is using it on top of their direct fired kilns that they've got there, have racks above it where they dry up the barley, and then they use it through, for those of you who've been to a distillery before, they mill the barley down into something that looks a bit like wholemeal flour called grist, mix it with some water to extract all the sugars from there and a few other chemicals as well. Throw it into the washbacks or the fermenters to then ferment with some yeast. And after somewhere between a day or two and maybe a whole week, depending on which distillery you're going to, you then end up with something that tastes a bit like beer, but you don't want to drink too much of it because it's still live and will make your stomach explode or give you a very, very dodgy tummy for several hours afterwards if you do drink a lot of it. A sip's good, but it's like drinking anything live. It's moderation. Is you don't want to start drinking pints of the stuff. that would end very badly. Then you basically go through the wash still, distill it, and then go through the spirit still and distill again, and you end up with your new make spirit, which is clear but will taste very, very peaty. So I was lucky enough or unlucky enough to try Supernova New Make, which someone at Glenmorangie sent me by accident. I didn't know it was Supernova at the time because all it said was heavy. Yeah, so I don't think it was one of the trade reps at Glenmorangie. So when they started first playing around at Ardbeg, they weren't as big a cult status as they are today. So you could buy all sorts and get your hands on all sorts from them. I got a kilo of Supernova malt, and I got a 500 ml bottle of Supernova New Make, which I could best describe as diesel. It was so intensely peaty. I love peaty whiskey. I think it was almost undrinkable. My Irish friend begs to differ, and he ended up with a whole bottle and loved the stuff. So it just comes down to personal taste, but it's a
whole bottle of the New Make. Wow. So we'll come. I guess we'll come on to that a bit later, onto the perception and some of the very interesting things that you've tasted and been working on. So it's at this stage that the phenol is making its way into the barley. what is phenol exactly? People talk about it a lot. They throw around the word, and what exactly?
As you've got on that slide there, basically, these are kind of the ways we draw chemicals as chemists, and we're as lazy as possible. So if we want to make a nice, pretty presentation, we use the one kind of on the left that's got the 3D images. If we're doing stuff to talk about it, we kind of use it with some lines and can draw it quite quickly. So I have a few little things with me. So here we have most of our favorite molecule here, ethanol or alcohol. So the red ones are oxygens, the white ones are hydrogens, the black ones are carbons. So you've got this ethanol or ethyl alcohol. You've got 2 carbons and then a hydroxyl unit on there. If you get a bit bigger, then you get to this bad boy here, which is phenol itself. So you've got an aromatic ring. So if you took that off and had a hydrogen there, it'd be called benzene. And what we have there with just an alcohol unit coming off the aromatic ring is called phenol. And this is just one molecule, but there's a whole range of them. So for peat smoke, basically a journal paper that was done a few years back looked at kind of what you could measure in peat smoke, and they actually measured 46 different phenols in there. And what you tend to get is basically treat them a bit like Lego, and you swap bits out. So if you swapped that one onto for a carbon with some extra hydrogens on there, you've got creosol. You swap it out for an O-methyl, you've got guaiacol. And if you put that and that on, then you have eugenol, which is the flavor of cloves. So they all kind of have this core bit in the middle, and it's just different bits bolted on. And just quite a small change to those molecules can give them completely different flavors and completely different properties. And kind of phenols, the whole class or family, that is what they talk about.
Yeah, so it's not just one aroma even we're talking about then. So and also it's not just coming from the peat either.
The ppms that you can get, if we're talking about Islay whiskies that have got heavy amounts of peat in there, you can pretty much ignore everything else because it's very, very small amounts. But if you've ever had an unpeated whiskey and go, actually that tastes a bit smoky to me, or a bit medicinal, or are you sure it's not peated? You can actually taste to really low levels of peat. And if you're not adding of phenols, and if you're not adding peat at the start of the process, you can detect the ones that are coming from other sources. So one of them is from the barley itself. So there's a couple of molecules in there that are kind of like 2 or 3 phenols attached together. And the yeast basically chops those up into phenols that you can then get through the fermentation process. And then when you actually get into the cask itself, if you look at the sort of inside of a cask, you've probably heard about them being charred. So you've got a layer of carbon in the middle. And then if you look through on the side, you end up with a spirit that basically penetrates through the wood during the time it's matured. And those phenols that you get in come from burning the peat. And the peat is basically a type of plant. The oak's a type of plant. If you start burning it and charring it, you're going to release some phenols on the surface that you can then absorb in spirit. And over time, you're not applying the heat, but because you've got 10, 15 years in the cask, it's long enough for just sitting there in the alcohol to extract some of those phenols by breaking down the long molecules that make up the wood. So linin's a really good one. It's what's known as a polyphenol. It's a big long chain of phenols all strapped together, and getting that chopped up by reactions over time, you end up with a whole range of things. So you have some of the flavor molecules that we associate with age, like synapaldehyde and vanillin. So if you've ever had the vanilla flavor in whiskey, that comes from the cask and being broken down. And just in the same way, yeah.
That's my favorite one, vanillin. Vanillin, perfect.
Easy, looks very similar to a phenol, just with an extra few bits bolted onto it. And the whole range that you can get there. So if you've ever had a cask and you go, I'm sure this tastes peated to me, I'm getting some smoky flavors in there, it could well be that you're picking up the ones from fermentation and from the cask itself.
So it's also likely that you'll get more peaty flavor, you'll get more phenol from the cask and from barley than you would actually.
Yeah, so kind of if you take a well-known triple distilled distillery just outside of Glasgow, then their young spirit normally has about half a ppm of phenols in it by the time it's in bottle. And depending on how sensitive you are to them, most people can detect down to 2 ppm. And if you're a super taster or particularly sensitive, you can go down to 0.05 ppm. So it's well within the threshold then for quite a young whiskey that's been triple distilled. So it's taken probably as much of those fermentation phenols out as possible. And you've got a very short time in cask because it's one of their young and no age statement ones. So if you take something that's got a more rough and ready distillation style, and that's had 50 years in a sherry cask in there, you've got a chance of getting not just more tannins in there, but a load of phenols in there as well. And the thing to bear in mind, tannins themselves are polyphenols and can break down to form more phenols.
Right, okay. So tannins,
so they're made up with whole chains of phenols out there, which again get extracted out of the wood. So they can again get broken down to give you more phenols, which you don't notice it on an Islay. But if you're having something that's completely unpeated, then you'll start to pick up some of those smoky medicinal notes from other sources.
Okay, so that is well and truly busted in that case. Definitely water has nothing to do with the peaty flavour of any whiskey. Just a couple of questions one I spotted earlier, and I guess we'll come on to it a little bit later in more detail, but where's it gone? It was about whether it's carcinogenic.
Yeah, we'll answer that one shortly.
We'll essentially get onto that one. But in a lot of detail. So peat smoke being carcinogenic, we'll come onto that in a lot more detail. And also the valley peat from the centre of Scotland. Yeah, different peats having different styles.
And Chanel's question around wet peat as well. We'll come back to that one.
And I didn't say, how does dry or wet peat affect the barley? Okay, yes.
Absolutely.
We're mine
hours up to 10, I think, today.
So we'll move on to our next whiskey and next myth, Too Busted. So the next thing we're going to move on to is the CL12, which back to more Kalila. Frankly, Kalila is a big favourite of ours at Elixir Distillers. I think I've heard Ollie say on numerous occasions that it's impossible to bottle a bad Kalila, impossible. He said he has tasted some, but whoever's responsible deserves to be thrown in the sea. So because it is consistently fantastic, really. So biggest distillery on Islay. And as we were discussing earlier, often those citrusy, definitely lemon or orange notes. And uses barley malt specification of 35 to 40 ppm, but we'll have a look at their stills later and see that actually the process creates quite a light spirit. Although it's smoky, it's peated, it's actually got this quite mineral, flinty character to it. This one is actually matured in 2 sherry butts. So although we've got that, I think probably more orange for me on this one, but also that immediately from the sherry butts, I get a little bit more of a bit of a butterscotch thing on the nose straight away. And the sort of meatier smoke, barbecue smoke.
I don't think I've had any bad version of Cahuilla, so not so much bottlings, but in any cask you put in and at any age. So I've had 3 to 4-year-old Cahuillas, and they've all been really good, from bourbon, sherry, some more unusual casks, and it's such a flexible peated whiskey.
Yeah. That's the thing about it as well, isn't it? It is so flexible, young or old. You're right. It can actually, because it's such a light spirit. And again, we'll look at it later, the way it's distilled, but it is a really sort of light spirit, which the new make is already delicious. You could just do that by the gallon.
I love both Cahuilla and Lagavulin and new makes. I thought I had a habit a few years back where I kept going hassling Colin Dunn for, have you got any Lagavulin new make? I just love that stuff. It was really
yeah. I really love the Cahuilla. So it's just so sweet and lovely and delightful. Young or old, and then it ages incredibly well as well. So this was just from 2 sherry butts. So as I say, everything we do is super small batches, and increasingly actually our batches have sort of been getting smaller and smaller. The original idea with Elements of Islay is that we would have 1 to 20 casks in our small batches. Islay is obviously a very, very popular thing at the moment, and it's increasingly difficult to get hold of passive Islay whiskey, although we still have a fair bit left, but our batches are getting a little bit smaller. So yeah, this is made up of 2 sherry butts. And yeah, it's just a little bit of butterscotch. I think it's refill sherry, so it's not overpowering. It's still kind of got that distillate character very much there. It's not overpowered by cask, but you do have a little bit more of that kind of unctuous butterscotch note.
Yeah,
and the peat's quite different to what I get from the peat as a blended malt. That's obviously a higher volume as well, so it's 57. 57.5%. But
really nice oily note, and kind of not kippers flavors, but the kind of oiliness you get with kippers. Yeah, the texture is really unctuous on Cahuilla. I always find, so particularly on grams. So it'd be a good point to answer Chanel's question is, so do all Islay whiskies use Islay peat? And Chanel was asking how wet peat affects barley. Well, you have to dry it out to use it to, otherwise it's not going to catch fire. So for those summers when it's been quite wet on Islay, which happens quite a bit, they do get a bit of rain over there. They have to import or basically get the peat in from other sources to use particularly in Port Ellen, where they've got the higher kind of use of peat over there. So they don't use wet peat, they just use dry peat. The reason you might see them wetting the peat is if the fire's getting out of hand, because they want that smoke rather than the actual heat from the peat. If it starts catching too well, once it's on fire, they might hose it down a little bit just to up the smoke and drop the heat a little bit. But when they're starting off, they always want dry peat, which is why sometimes they can't always use 100% Islay peat on there. And for those of you that don't know, there's not an awful lot of room to grow barley. So the majority of the barley you use isn't from Islay originally. So it's one of the things where you see like Kilcoman do 100% Islay, or some of the other distilleries where they do local barley. I was kind of making a point of that because a lot of the barley could be from elsewhere in Scotland or even further afield.
I guess it would really be impossible, in fact, for every distillery on Islay to get all their barley and all their peat from Islay. That just would not
be a lot bigger
for the
and a lot
yeah, exactly. And a lot drier as well for everyone to know. So yeah, it's very, very difficult to grow and harvest barley. And I think, obviously not every distillery on the island is even claiming to use Islay peat. So there's a handful of distilleries that still have their own maltings, but none of them are using 100% of their own barley from their own maltings for the process. They'll use a proportion of their own maltings, and then the rest they'll get in from Port Ellen or from a different maltings on the mainland. So Port Ellen maltings is though providing a lot of the distilleries with their peated malt. And I think the assumption would be that if you're using Port Ellen maltings is going to be using Islay peat. However, it's just not possible. As you say, they do get a little bit of rain on Islay. It's not the driest place in the world. So I think we were there a few years ago. And it had been a particularly wet season, and it was just they weren't able to use any of the peat that they had. I've actually never quite understood. So obviously at the beginning of the process, when you're cutting the peat and then leaving it out to dry, it seems to be always stacked and left outside to dry. Is that right? What? Like you couldn't dry it inside?
Then you have to have a building to do it. Leaving it out to dry to begin with, and then once it's dried, then you move it in.
Yeah, just sort of feels a bit of a myth of Sisyphus sort of. You don't feel like it's ever going to be done drying peat on Islay, but evidently it doesn't.
The other thing is, if you move it somewhere to dry out, it weighs a lot more when it's wet. So as it dries out, it gets lighter.
Very true, actually.
If you go back to traditional times, if you're on a horse and cart, or some poor person has to carry it.
Yeah, just like I think it was the woman's job, as far as I'm aware, to like men we used to cut the peat, and the women used to haul these like massive bags of wet peat.
So when it's wet, you're doubling or tripling the weight for each kind of block of peat. So
yeah. So yeah, not everywhere is using Isla peat at all. Even at Port Ellen Maltings, where the assumption would be, and generally they try to use Isla peat, it doesn't always come from Isla. So why does it matter? So is Isla peat different from peat from other areas, which is a question we've had in there as well. So I know you shared a paper with me, Adam, on the Shackleton.
So if any of you want to kind of really geek out and get into whiskey kind of science, if you search for the for Shackleton or McKinley's malt and look for a paper, it tells the kind of the work that went into them forming the first kind of replica that they did. But the analysis they did on the bottles they found under Shackleton's hut in Antarctica from around 100 years ago. And they basically do as much as they can to authenticate it and figure out which distilleries and what kind of whiskey it was and where it came from. And one of the ways they do that is looking at the phenol content in there for the peated malt. And they find out what peating level was there. So it was a medium peated whiskey. And then they also look at the kind of different chemicals that they found in there. And you find quite a different set of chemicals in Isla peat to what you do in Orkney peat. So Orkney peat, you tend to find some stuff that aren't normally called phenols. They're kind of another type of aromatic compounds called benzene derivatives. And one in particular is naphthalene, which gives it quite like a mothbally flavour, which is a little bit different to what you see from Isla. And you get something, again, quite different if you having peat that's cut near Speyside, which is a little bit more heathery as in the kind of vegetation that formed it. So you get a little more drier, kind of more coke smoky type flavours out of that. Yeah. I think we got Katy back again.
Everything was going a bit too smoothly there. But I'm back, yes. I came in for the mothballs.
I think we're all going to have different types of different areas. Of
okay, so yeah, different areas are going to be giving different flavors.
I've just seen Lee Connor's comment on that.
I know.
Now have my head. Thank you for
that. I know. I can't stop singing it in my head now. I feel like it's going to come out at some point. Actually, let's just take this question now as well. This is exactly one I asked as well. Does the salty flavour in Isla whiskies come from the sea salt infused in the peat? Is there even a salty Isla whiskies? I think we associate, and you're right, I think we make these associations. I asked exactly the same question myself to Adam.
And so a great one is Lefroy that you has the sea or maritime type notes in there. If any of you got a whiskey with you, Sequila, I know that Katy gets salty notes in this. I get a more metallic flavour, which is probably the kind of flavours that you're picking up as salty. If you pinch your nose as hard as you can, and now try to prick it a little bit.
I tried this the other day, and I must say the alcohol hits you quite hard when you've got your nose covered. So yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah. So if you try doing that, you only pick up salt actually in your mouth, and there's no salty flavors there. It's quite sweet, as just on the taste. All the things that you're associating with saltiness are actually in your nose, and it's probably something that reminds you of the seaside that you're picking up on. So be some kind of metallic flavor in there that you're going, I know what that is. That's ozone, that's sea spray, that's seaweed, and you're making those associations in your brain. But salty as it is, there's very few whiskies that are salty. It's just we're getting those flavors or more kind of nosing comments or kind of sensations in your nose that make you think of saltiness or remind you of the seaside.
Yeah, there's certainly no actual salt there, is there? And there's nowhere else that a salty flavour can come from. So, yeah, very much our association with those flavours of being by the sea.
And it helps that all the marketing campaigns to talk about the vaults being by the sea, or this warehouse being by the sea, or the distillery being there, and just those imagery, you're already looking for those notes, even if they're not there, and even if you don't pick them up yourself, you're going to start thinking about those, because all the kind of psychology around the marketing and the way it's kind of pitched to you is making you think about maritime
the power
things.
of suggestion is strong, isn't it? Yeah. I'm terrible for it. Well, as soon as someone tells me a tasting note, I'm like, yes, 100%, I'm getting that.
Yeah, which is one of the things I found kind of with tastings. You go one of two ways, and there's people go, yes, I absolutely get that tasting note completely, and other people, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I don't get that. Yeah, I'm going to ignore anything you say.
Yeah. I'm awful for suggestion. So not all Islay whiskies use Islay peat. Not only that, but the main source of peated barley on Islay, Port Ellen maltings, isn't even always able to use peat from Islay. So although the different regions give you different flavors, actually Islay peat isn't always what's used in the production. So we could be getting all sorts of different flavors from different regions of peat, even in Islay whiskey. So next up is the PL6. So PL, another one which is not a distillery. We're on to a different make here, and this is Port Charlotte.
Is there a reason for PL rather than PC?
Well, I think they did their own PC, didn't they, Brewcladding?
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
So we choose kind of letters at random, and try to make them not real chemical symbols, but we've failed a little bit on that, I think. So yeah, PL is Port Charlotte, and this is the 6th edition, which is 3 bourbon barrels of 2011 Port Charlotte, and it's a heavily peated spirit from Brewcladding. So Brewcladding, they have their unpeated spirit as Brewcladding, the heavily peated Port Charlotte, and then their Optimal, which is, we'll talk a lot more about, I'm sure, but the supposedly most heavily peated whiskey. And this already actually is an interesting sort of starting point in talking about Optimal, I think, because for me, this has a really different type of peat to what you get from Kalila, say, or certainly from what you get from Kalila. Even though it's a higher ppm, I find this to be actually totally different peat. It's not really smoky to me.
For me, Port Charlotte's my favourite from Brewcladding. Always reminds me of Balekin from Edward Hour. It's got that farmyardy kind of cereally. It just feels dirty.
People say this like farmyardy in this kind of horse stables sort of way. But I think cereally definitely. I find it quite malty often, and I actually find it quite green as well. But a lovely mix of that kind of grainy, kind of wet grain, horse stable. It's certainly a kind of dirty farm rather than a smoke smell going on. I really like it, but with that green note to it as well.
Had a question from Lee around why is there an evolutionary reason for us liking smoky flavors? And the kind of answer is the opposite of that. We've evolved not to like smoky flavors because things being on fire is bad, and fire is bad, and we want to run away from fire. So we've evolved to not like those flavors. So it's very much kind of nurture rather than nature. Because when you start off, you like sweet things, sour, bitter notes, or things you don't like. As when you're very little, and you basically have to train your palate to like them. Yeah. So it's evolutionary. You shouldn't like peaty whiskies. You kind of trained yourself through your previous years to go, oh, I quite like that.
That's the one, isn't it? Actually, that's the reason my brother gives for liking peaty whiskies. Is he likes the way it tastes a bit wrong, like something you shouldn't really be drinking, but it's okay. I suppose it's a comforting thing, isn't it? But I guess, like you say, it is nurture. It reminds you of some sort of, I don't know.
And there's probably something that kind of reminiscent of cooking out, barbecues, things like that, like smoked fish. Is once you've had those kind of associations in there, you're kind of associating the smoky flavors in the whiskey with those kind of memories.
Yeah, definitely. It's that cozy fireside smell, isn't it? But that's interesting, but it's very much definitely nurture and nature. I think, I absolutely love this. This is just a couple of bourbon barrels. It's got a bit of vanilla as well to it. It's got a nice bit of sweetness, but it's quite a divisive one. I find Port Charlotte. It's quite a Marmite whiskey. I think probably because of those dirty farmyard flavors. It's not the immediate thing you'd say if you were asked what you want, what you'd like as a flavor. So Steph is saying, but we did spend thousands of years cooking things and living next to fires, so we would have thought we'd evolved to find the smell comforting and pleasing. Do you evolve with those habits?
I think probably it's been too short, because a couple of thousand years of cooking, is it 10,000 years or something like that? Is evolutionary terms, that's not that long for us.
So and our myth then is a big one.
Yeah.
I need to know the ppm. How peaty is this whiskey? I need to know the ppm. And this is probably the biggest.
Yeah. And we've lost Katie again, but spoilers, you don't. So we'll see if she comes back in a second or not. Or she's crashing off. We'll give her a minute. No. Oh, she's back.
Okay, yeah. So that's the big one, isn't it? That people ask all the time. As soon as you give somebody a smoky or an Islay whiskey or a peaty whiskey, they immediately ask, "What's the ppm?" Thinking that is going to be the be all and end all of knowing how peaty the whiskey is. Obviously, this is kind of what you've done a lot of work on, Adam. So we've got a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, probably more than actually healthy than anyone really needed to do. But it's kind of the obsession and kind of detail orientated bit in me is kind of yes, I probably know the answer, but the knowing and being able to prove it are two different things. So it's kind of I going down a rabbit hole about 2-3 years ago and stuff.
And then usually when I go down a rabbit hole, it's like onto Wikipedia for a few hours. I love this 3-year rabbit hole.
It's a 3-year rabbit hole with access to cutting edge analytical equipment and lots of.
Well, I for one am delighted that you've done this.
But we do have a couple of papers in the works, but unfortunately, one of my co-authors decided to get engaged, buy a house, start a new job, and get pregnant all in the space of 2 weeks when she was due to finish writing her part of the paper. I know. Apparently, finishing the paper wasn't high on her priorities. For like 9 months.
Priority.
So we have to.
So I think Port Charlotte, obviously, as we said, a heavily peated whiskey from Brewfladdie, and I guess probably Octomore is one of the things that sparked this whole obsession with ppm. And we were having a chat yesterday when we were talking whiskey versus rum. We were talking about how so Sam Simmons was saying perhaps it's the fact that it's quantifiable, and as soon as there's something quantifiable to cling on to, that's what people ask for. But I guess this is where it started, right?
Absolutely. And so you go back probably about 15-20 years when Ardbeg had just been reborn and Glenmorangie had taken over again. Ardbeg was the benchmark of ppm, so depending on which source you go from, it was either 55 or 54 ppm, and that's kind of measured in malt, and that was always the peatiest whiskey in the world was Ardbeg, and you've got Lefroy just behind it in the mid-40s, got Lagavulin just behind that, and Brewfladdie was well and truly in its place at 3 or 4 ppm with its very lightly peated whiskey by Islay standards. And then they brought out Port Charlotte and then put down the futures and the longer term projects they got on Octomore, and slowly started increasing from 70s and 80s that they did for the future batches, and then went up to, I think the first ones I had were around the 100 ppm mark, until the one that they've done that's the highest one so far, which is the 8.3 batch, which is 309 parts per million phenols in bottle. In malt. And so it was a bit of an arms race. So you had Supernova was kind of Ardbeg after Buacladi kind of fired a shot across their bows, going, "We've got peatier whiskey than you, no." Ardbeg Supernova as kind of a response to that. And there's been a few other notable mentions. So their Lost Spirits over in the States have done some very heavily peated whiskies as well. Or so rather, I should say, heavily peated spirit drinks sourcing a malted barley beverage of undisclosed origin from an undisclosed European famed for making peated beverages.
So not restricted to Islay anyway. The peaty arms brace. And what is ppm? So we've talked about phenol, but ppm is the obsession. What is ppm?
So if kind of you ask the kind of, I've got a peaty whiskey, what's the ppm? As a chemist, my answer would be, what? Because ppm is it's very similar. It's a way of measuring stuff in the same way that you use percent. So it's like asking what the percent is. You guess they were talking about the ABV, but it could be what's the score. The reason you use ppm is the numbers we're talking about are really, really small. So if I said something like 426,000 ppm to kind of describe what the ABV was, it just doesn't make sense to us. But likewise, if I was saying 0.00002% rather than the ppm levels, you get lost in your head around, is that a big number? Is that a small number? Whereas if you go 10 ppm, 50 ppm, they're easy to compare. It's just a good way to get our head around it. So 1 ppm is if you have a million molecules in there, one of them will be peat if it was a 1 ppm. If it's 100 ppm, 100 out of the million would be those kind of phenol molecules in there.
Okay. So ppm, not necessarily phenol at all, but we're just assuming whenever we're talking about Islay whiskey, we can make an assumption.
And William Grant have now invented a completely new unit of the SPPM, which is the sweet ppm. I think it was on their Islay Bay release. It's kind of, why have you done that? And it's just kind of compounding the confusion around what ppm are. It's kind of, no, it's the same thing. You're just adding up different molecules.
Yeah, okay. That could be the new obsession, though, I suppose.
Absolutely. More things to measure and get results for.
And as we've said already, I think we've probably touched on it, but phenols are measured in the malt, not the whiskey, in fact.
So just like, so working in the pharmaceutical industry, if I buy raw materials in, I want to get a specification with them to show that they meet exactly what I want them to do. And just in the same way, distilleries have a specification for their malt, and there's a whole range of things in there around kind of what enzyme levels they've got in there, what water content, whether they've got certain impurities that will carry through and basically end up with a bad spirit at the end. And one of them, if it's peated malt, is the ppm level of phenols that they've got in there. And one of the reasons that they use that number, and they've kind of moved on from not just using it for their own purposes, they've already got it and they didn't have to pay for it directly anyway. So it's a free number that they can use as a marketing tool. So when the kind of Ardbeg Octomore arms race started, it was an easy thing for them to kind of share and go back and forth. Ours is a little bit higher than yours, so it must be peatier. And they got a number to hang off their statements from. But there's a lot of things that happen to your whiskey from having that peated malt going all the way through to the end of the process, and not all is fair in love and war.
Okay. Sorry, that was an error. Didn't mean to get overexcited. But as you said, the distilleries don't need to measure for it themselves. But how is it measured for?
So if anyone who reads up quite a bit, they might have heard about colorimetry, which was the way it used to be measured, and it's quite a bit of like a kind of fire and brimstone that you idea. I can see both of us at the moment. Yeah, I think we'll carry on. Hopefully it works. I think you've frozen now.
I'm here. Are you? Okay, great.
Okay, good. I'm here. We're all systems go. Yeah, so the colorimetry thing, if you imagine kind of your chemistry lab with all the bubbling tubes all over the place, it's kind of like that you're extracting stuff from the grain, bubbling it through and adding all different colors and then measuring those colors. It was very, very rubbish at giving accurate results because wasn't just sensitive for phenols, didn't pick all them up. You had to get the phenols out of the grain into your kind of extraction and all your weird chemistry kit. So these days, most places use some form of liquid chromatography, and LC is the most common one, which this is kind of what you'd see if you do a liquid chromatography on a sample of whiskey. This is what I did see when I did do a chromatography on a sample of whiskey. And the way you end up with the total phenols there is you, if you imagine, you basically get a graph and a peak for each of those phenols. You draw a line on the bottom, measure how much area there is, and compare to the area of a standard. And you figure out how much there is relative to a standard and figure out what concentration you've got there. And your total phenol content is you add all those ones up. I think there was a question there from Aaron on the thing, is do you all measure ppm the same way? And the answer is no. Going back a long time ago, they used colorimetry, which gave quite different results. It could be quite high, quite low, but generally quite variable. And even if you're using the same method, if different testing sites would get different results, because you always get a little bit of bias from one analytical site to another. Most places tend to use liquid chromatography these days. Octomore, when it was measured and they put up the C of A on there, that was done by liquid chromatography. But the thing they don't all do is, I mentioned earlier, there's around 40 or 50 phenols in peat smoke. They don't measure all 40 or 50 phenols. When I've looked at methods online that different companies use, they range from about 7 phenols through to about 15. When I've been doing my work, I picked the 13 phenols that are most common and that almost everyone seems to include in there. So kind of the ones that seem to be the most useful.
Are they using those because they're the most present, or they're the easiest to measure for, or both?
Most common, basically. So they're either they're in the largest amounts or the ones that are really important. So the likes of phenol is normally the most common phenol that you get in any of the whiskies, because it comes, any kind of polyphenol is probably going to end up making some phenol in there. But guaiacol and eugenol are normally measured. Guaiacol is really, really strongly medicinal flavored. And eugenol, if you've ever smelled cloves or clove oil, it's the chemical that gives it that flavor. So it's a really spicy clove note on there. So just a small amount of it has a really big impact on the flavor and can make the whiskey taste really spicy.
And that's, I was interested by that because I've heard this a few times now, that's that clove smell. So would you expect to find that in a peaty whiskey? Would you expect to ever find a clovey smell in peat, or do you think that the smoky flavor is sort of?
It's always there. So in all the Islay whiskies I've measured, it's always present, but it's kind of fighting against the bigger flavors. So when I played around making some very, very peaty whiskies, guaiacol is just wipes everything out because it's so much stronger. So like for like, guaiacol is about 2,000 times more flavorsome than phenol. So if you wanted to measure them up, you need 2,000 ppm phenol to count the same as 1 ppm guaiacol.
Okay.
To give you an idea of just how strongly guaiacol smells, is the room I'm in at the moment, it smells a bit like guaiacol because this one was in the plastic box up in my loft, which contains Tupperware boxes of my phenol samples, which are in screw-type, airtight containers inside the Tupperware box. This still smells really strongly of guaiacol, so it's kind of a really strong flavour. So it's kind of a meaty, medicinal, metallic type flavour.
I actually just went to get a bottle of water earlier, and also I'd actually put some cloves in a bottle to show like the different smells of different compounds. About 2 years ago, and I went to smell my bottle, it still smelled of cloves, and I was like, oh, maybe I can use this one. I was like, no, that one smells of TCP. So clearly both for the same sort of purpose. So that is the way that we're measuring for phenol now, and not all compounds are being measured for then. And not only is not everything being measured for, and that's what ppm is, but what happens to phenols during the whole process.
And it's a little bit small to read some of these ones, but basically most of the Islay malts, if you're starting from a really heavily peated whiskey, it's going to lose somewhere between 40 and 80% of its phenol content by the time it gets to new make. Because you're starting off with the phenols are sat on the outside of the husks of the malt in there. You're then whacking it into some water, and that hoping to extract some of those phenol compounds along with the sugars into the wash. And then it's going to be used. Some of those are going to be used up by the yeast or changed by the yeast during fermentation. Because someone once described, I think it was a Bacardi rep a few years ago, described yeast as a bit like Pac-Man that eats sugar, farts CO2, and pisses alcohol. I think it's a really good example of how it actually works. That's kind of day job, but then when it kind of goes off piste, it can use different alcohols and different compounds and make other stuff. So it kind of has a hobby on the side to make different flavors on the go as well. So it can use some of those phenols up. And then you're going through at least two rounds of distillation where you're trying to separate the alcohol from the water. And most of the phenols quite like water. So while some of them are going to come with the alcohol, others are going to sit in the water, which is why when you come to doing your cuts in your spirit run, where you make your cut points is really, really important. So you can get a lot more phenols kept in your spirit if you leave the cut to faint quite late, because that's when you're getting water coming through and more the oily and heavier phenols are coming through.
Yeah, and that's where I think we've got a really good example of that. I think this is very small. I know. If anyone's watching and wants to look at this slide, you can double click on the screen share, then it will bring it up full screen for you. But also, you can. We can explain the concept of this anyway.
Indeed. So kind of going back to the first dram of the night, the peat that used Cahuilla and Lagavulin in there. They're kind of sister distilleries, both run by Diageo, to very similar ethos. They both start with similar ppm levels. So Cahuilla is generally 30 to 35. Lagavulin's 35 to I think 38, 40. They both use Port Ellen maltings, but Lagavulin I always find tastes a lot peatier than Cahuilla does, and it has a much heavier, oilier note on there. And that comes down primarily to how they run their stills. So I often, when I talk about Lagavulin, I love it to bits, but I often describe it as the worst made whiskey in the industry. Like if you're gonna how should you run your stills? Exactly how Lagavulin don't. So they have this horrible stubby little still that's really fat and really short, and they fill it all the way up to the top, and they run it really quickly, and they have a really wide cut to faint. So they cut to faint at 59% alcohol, which last time I checked was the lowest in the Scotch industry. So it's a really late cut. So they're capturing a lot of those oily fusel oils and a lot of the phenols along with it to get that really unctuous mouthfeel that you get in Lagavulin, which is kind of it's everything, running a plant and kind of seeing how you should run a process. Yeah, we if that was how one of my chemists was running a process on plant, I'd tear my hair out. Going, no, you're doing it all wrong. You need to do it slower. You need to put less in. It breaks all the rules of kind of good production in terms of if you wanted to get the purest, cleanest spirit. But because they do that, they get such interesting compounds out of there because they're running it with such a full still, and they're getting so real interesting oily compounds in there as well. I just love it to bits.
Yeah, and that's where you get this totally different style from the two distilleries. So, and that I think all of this well and truly has busted the myth that you need to know the ppm to know how peaty your whiskey is. So not only, the process is going to remove lots of those phenols anyway. Not every phenol is measured for. It's a good starting point, I guess, but really, realistically, it doesn't tell us a whole load about how peaty our whiskey is.
Yeah, it comes down to if it's a big number, it's going to be peaty. If it's a little number, it's not going to be very peaty. And that's about how much stock as you need to put into it, really.
A couple of questions coming in. So is it possible in theory to make a malt charged with a specific type of phenol to have other more medicinal or more bonfire tones and so on?
Yes, it is, but it would be illegal to call it Scotch at that point, I'm guessing, or at best quite dubious. And if you were going to do it that way, it's much easier just to charge the bottle with the phenols at the end, which is what I did.
Yes, which we'll come to in a bit as well. So essentially, you're talking about actually adding, like, sort of synthetically adding the phenols to the.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick's comment, yeah. So kind of more reflux. You get a finer spirit. It's more around the cut point. So how much is actually getting through? So you're probably not going to change the phenols too much during reflux. It's where you're actually diverting from the spirit cut. So only the heart of the spirit run makes it through to the end spirit. If you cut too early to faints and send that back to the faints and low wines receiver, they're not going to make it through to the end spirit. They're just going to keep getting recycled.
So it's at the beginning of the run that you're getting most of them.
At the end of the run, so on the faint end, yeah. So they're quite heavy phenols, and they like water slightly more than they like alcohol. So they tend to come up towards the end of the run.
So on to our final, once we've now busted all myths so far, we're going to get on to our last whiskey and final myth. And we're going on to the LP10. So some of the very, very rarest of the elements of Islay bottlings lately. Lafroig is, of course, increasingly more difficult to get hold of. It's got a real cult status, cult following, and not a huge distillery either. And it's obviously very, very well known as a single malt. So LP10 is our 10th batch of Lafroig, which was from 2 bourbon barrels. And Lafroig sort of sits up there with one of the heaviest peated, well, according to ppm, you know, in the malt specification, it has one of the on the island. And again, to me, actually, I always get something from Lafroig. To me, it's it's almost quite a juicy, like red fruit note that I get from Lafroig. I don't know what it is. It's certainly a very, very specific flavour, and everybody always talks about kind of TCP having a very medicinal character, and that definitely is there, and that's sort of what often sets Lafroig apart from other distilleries on that very distinctive sort of iodine aroma.
The thing we talked about is I always assumed that came from them cutting their own peat from their own peat source and then burning it as some of their stock that's going through. And it turns out it probably isn't. So we found kind of an article a few years ago that was saying they actually ran a batch where they used just their own peated barley that they'd done themselves, their own peat, and then malting it themselves. And it lost the kind of iodine medicinal notes. So they actually come from the Port Ellen malted barley that they use, which goes into all the other ones. So it's something about the way they run their process and the way they run their stills. So it's kind of like, that's quite unusual and intriguing. That's not what we thought.
The process, not actually their the malts that they do in their own maltings. And what do you know what it's likely to be in their process that brings all that through?
No idea whatsoever. My kind of best guess would be because we do kind of problem solving on those. We're making the assumption because they only did one batch, so they could have changed other things in that batch as well. It could have been straight after a clean down where all the underbacks and all the charging vessels were brand spanking new, or it could be something because they have the different still sizes as well. So they have one still that's a different size to the other ones. It could be that they went through just one still size, and it's down to that still size and where they put their cut points in that still that gives those flavors, and that is quite different.
There was a whole load of change.
Yeah, you'd want to do a full design of experiments and do multiple batches, changing lots of little things, and it'd be a tough job. I'd be willing to do it for Lafroig and test it for them and taste all the various ones to make the right conclusion.
But this is. I don't know what do you get from this?
So with Lafroig, I think I mentioned briefly in an email to you that This is where kind of if any of you read any of my blogs or any of the stuff I do, I very rarely do tasting notes, because my opinion is my tasting notes are pretty much pointless for anyone else. And tasting notes are really, really quite a personal thing. You might get a fruity note, and all of us will get something fruity, but as soon as you start going, oh, well, I get pineapple or I get peaches, and you end up with a whole range on those, because we're interpreting them partly because of our own kind of the mechanics of how our olfactory senses work, that we're actually getting different things. You might be more sensitive to a particular chemical than I am. But then also your experiences, so kind of smell and olfaction are really strongly linked with memory. So you not only get stuff that is there, but get stuff in associated smells. So for Laphroaig, for me, always smells like linseed oil and ginger, and neither of those flavors are actually there. But I always get them because I grew up playing chess with my granddad over his homemade chessboard that had been polished with linseed oil above his bakery. And when I was very young, eating gingerbread man while he was drinking Laphroaig 10, and a little bit older drinking green ginger wine, and a little bit older still whiskey max with Laphroaig 10. And then eventually, so that ginger is ingrained in my brain. It's never there, but I always associate it. And even though I know it's not there, I still smell it.
Yeah, that's such a lovely thing about aroma. I suppose it's what's going to kind of come on to our final point as well, is it is so personal. And although you can try and make it as objective as you want, really, you're always going to have memories associated with different things that you're bringing in. So that's very lovely there. That sounds like a very sort of wholesome experience you had with Laphroaig, even though you didn't thinking it at first.
Yeah, it's and it wasn't. It's still one of my 3 desert island drams. Is for that reason is Laphroaig 10, but it wasn't the first one that I started drinking. Strangely, I kept my granddad tried to get me drinking it. It's like, no, it's horrible. It's far too like TCP, and I had to kind of ease myself in slowly through kind of a gateway whiskey.
But but it's your sort of your good memory dram, I suppose.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is absolutely fantastic, and as I say, increasingly rare and difficult to get hold of Laphroaig. The Elements of Islay LP bottlings are harder to come by, and smaller batches. But this was one of our latest ones, and absolutely wonderful. But sort of moving on from what you say there about sort of perception of flavour, another thing that I've heard people say is that you can only taste up to a certain level of phenol anyway. So as kind of 2 sides to the argument, when I hear people obsessed with ppm, I hear people on the other side say, oh, you can't even taste beyond a certain level of phenol anyway.
That one's true, but not in anything that anyone, with the exception of probably Julie on the call, and I think I saw a few of the Drambury veterans in there as well. The limit when it stops kind of tails off is around, depending on the person. If you ask my wife, who really doesn't like peated whiskey, she would say it's about 10 ppm. But me personally, who has a bit of a smokehead, it's somewhere between 50 and 200 ppm in bottle is where it gets overbearing, and you've got to be particularly careful with guaiacol, because guaiacol just So when I've made the world's peatiest malt-based spirit drink that cannot be called whiskey for legal reasons because I've added phenols to it, I did various kind of like prototype versions just to see how high could you taste. So I think the highest I actually tried taking more than a very, very small sip of was about 2,000 ppm in bottle. And it just tastes absolutely foul.
But you can taste it. It's not like...
the problem is it just becomes so one-dimensional. So I wanted to create a complete where all the phenols in there were just from being added. So I actually started from the same lowland triple distilled whiskey and put like a 40 or 50 ppm whiskey together. And it just tasted wrong. It tasted synthetic because you had all the phenols that were just sticking out without all the stuff that fills in the blanks. So just like you like your vanillin, if you have vanilla essence, it doesn't give you the full flavor of vanilla, whereas vanilla extract's much closer to that. So I had to start from a high ppm whiskey to begin with. So I picked up several litres of Coela and then doctored that by adding phenols to it. And it integrated a lot better then. The ones that I've actually would say were pleasant to drink, the highest one I've gone is this one, which is batch 3 of Science Whiskey.
Yeah.
And that's 121 ppm in bottle.
Wow.
And I would say it's drinkable. The best one I've had that I made was more like 70. So I've gone through several batches because it becomes too much. Not only can it become a bit overbearing, is most of the phenol, several of the phenols were actually used as anesthetics. So the more you use, the more you actually anesthetize your palate. So it's kind of more is definitely not more. You get up to a certain point and it sort of starts tailing off. So that 121 ppm only tastes about 5 or 10% more peaty than the ones I've done at 50. It's definitely diminished returns when you start really upping the ppm level.
Okay, so actually, to an extent, you can only taste to a certain level of phenol because you're anesthetizing your palate.
Yeah, and I guess for everyone would probably fall in the range of somewhere between 50 and 200 ppm. It'd be what they could taste for an Islay profile. So what I also found is no matter how much phenols they have in there, if you get an Islay malt, they all have a very similar phenol profile. They always have lots of one particular phenol and a small amount of different phenol. And one of the graphics that's going into kind of our paper is like, oh, look, you take the numbers off and just do them as a ratio. They all look very similar because they've got a very similar profile of those different medicinal to smoky to oily to clovey flavors.
Yeah. Okay. And I can't remember if we discussed a bit further down. I don't know if you're allowed to talk about, we've talked about this already, kind of different flavors associated with different types of phenol. But we were talking, and to answer the kind of carcinogenic question, what is the kind of highest level of phenol that we get in any, like in bottle, in any commercially available whiskey, if you're allowed to tell us that yet? And at what levels is it dangerous? And also, is there any legal level?
So I'll kind of work backwards. So I assumed there'd be a legal level because most of the phenols in there are generally toxic or at least harmful. But phenol itself is really nasty. It's a respiratory sensitizer. It's carcinogenic. But in the last 10 years, the only thing that I took more precautions with than handling phenol was handling chemical weapons. And it was only phenol was about here, chemical weapons were about there. So neat phenol is really, really nasty. You don't want to go anywhere near it. My father-in-law has a nice burn through the back of his hand when he dropped a single crystal of phenol on the back of his hand, and it anesthetized the back of his hand and burned a good kind of 2 or 3 mil into the back of his hand before he noticed. So phenol itself is really, really nasty. But luckily, we're only talking about ppm, so parts per million, where you've diluted and diluted and diluted down again. If you were going to neck a whole 700 ml bottle of a heavily peated whiskey, I reckon if it had 5,000 ppm in it, it'd be enough to kill you from the amount of phenol in there. So that's kind of once you're in the thousands, it's getting really dangerous at that point. When I've tried stuff that's had 1 to 10,000 in there, I've had like 5 mil or a mil and then washed my mouth out and mainly gone for the tasting. Go, Jesus, that's horrible. Throw that away or dilute it down some more and wait several days for my taste buds to recover. But kind of where you could go to is up to about 200 might still make a pleasant drink and would be safe. The only stuff I could see around a legal limit is actually what a recommended daily intake is and how much you normally get. So the phenols are present in anywhere where you add smoke flavor. So smoked cheeses have a lot of phenols in them, smoked sausages, you get quite a lot of content in there. So whiskies aren't going to have a huge amount compared with those. And even if you're drinking a reasonable amount. And in terms of in bottle, so Laphroaig is at 40 to 43 ppm is what they claim when they're doing a malt. When I measured it in bottle, it was down at 22. And when I was saying how does everyone measure phenols the same, part of the paper is looking what other people have claimed it is. So I found numbers for Laphroaig as low as 8 ppm and as high as 22. So ANOC have also measured it and got the same results I did when they were bringing out their They're kind of peat tart and they're their peated range. They measured theirs in bottle and measured other people's as a benchmark. Octomore 309, so it was 309 in malt. Those numbers at the top give you an idea of how much you lose by the time you get to bottle. So particularly for Octomore, phenol's the main one in there. Not published it yet, so with why it's not written on there, but I can reveal that the peatiest legal commercial Scottish whiskey is this one, but it's down to a measly 37 ppm by the time it actually gets to the bottle. So it's lost 80 or so % by the time it gets to the bottle.
37 ppm in bottle, Octomore. And what's the spirit that you've made? Sorry.
So the highest one we've done is 121 by adding phenols. Also got a batch that's hit 180 by extracting from wood. So how I mentioned, so without adding them themselves, when I mentioned you can get them from the wood, and you particularly start getting smoky notes in old 40, 50-year-old Speysides. So when you're getting the overwooded and lots of tanning notes coming through, I basically got a load of staves, cut them down into thin, basically whiskey sticks, filled the bottle.
Whiskey sticks.
And former oak staves, so it's an ex-bourbon cask from the Speyside cooperage, and put those ones in with some vodka and left them in for 3 years, so it could just about vaguely be called whiskey if you don't look at the rules too closely. But if it was America, it could probably be called whiskey. But that one came up as well over 150 ppm, and they were phenols that had got extracted from the wood because you got that amount of wood contact in there. But there is a commercially available whiskey that is not far off 100 ppm in bottle, and it starts off with 0 ppm in grain because it's not a peated whiskey.
Very, very interesting, but we're not allowed to know yet. There's going to be published as part of your result.
Anyone in the chat can take an educated guess.
And in bottle, it's how many? What's the ppm in bottle?
Just under 100
ppm. Has anyone got any guesses? Well, anyone who wants to can have a guess at what it is. Well, can you tell them if they're correct?
I can. If someone guesses right, I'll confirm or deny.
It's an unpeated spirit. It's not peated.
It's not Speyburn. not even the salmon cannon edition.
So the spirit is not peated, and then it's 100 ppm in bottle. And that's all we're allowed to know about it. Is it Scottish?
It's not Scottish DVD bloke. Good guess.
Are we?
Yep. Got it in 3, John.
So does he know already?
I think I might have mentioned it at the time. It's but he probably had quite a lot of whiskies at that point because that particular tasting was part of Drambury.
Yes,
so
I've never had the pleasure to go actually, but I've heard all about it, which is where I learned all your experiments to start with, and it's called that's very early morning tasting too. So it's really I guess.
Yeah, they had some last minute scheduling issues, so it was like the peatiest whiskies known to man, woman, child. And I had to rearrange the day. It was going to be the Saturday night. I had to move things around, so we had it at 10 a.m.
On the Saturday morning or the Sunday morning?
That was the Saturday, I think, yeah.
After 2 hours sleep, yeah. Doesn't sound ideal. So that is three myths busted there, and the final one, you can only taste up to a certain level of ppm, is basically true. But it's a pretty high level that you can taste up to, but gradually anaesthetizing your palate. So we are at the end of the session now. Does anyone have any questions at all? I think we've kind of answered going through, but let us know if you've got any more questions before we leave. Aaron, I think we answered that question. Have you done any research on peat levels, age, and dissipation of ppm? Absolutely. That's exactly where we got to at the end.
I think Lee's main aim tonight is give us both earworms for the rest of the day.
Oh, I haven't seen the last one. Was that just for you?
What becomes of the broken-hearted?
Right. Well, Adam, thank you so much. You have such incredible knowledge on the subject, and I for one, am delighted that you got down this three-year rabbit hole. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the results when your partner in crime decides to get their priorities right.
Just fingers crossed she decides one baby's enough, otherwise another year.
So yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much again, Adam, and yeah, soon as the rest of the show. Slange, see you soon. Bye.
See you all later.